All the best. Right, we now come to the urgent question. Dame Harriett Baldwin.
Yeah. To ask the Foreign Secretary if he will make a statement on the political and humanitarian situation in Sudan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like first to welcome the Right Honourable Lady to her place. Of course, as former African Minister, I know that she's deeply concerned about these issues. I'm very grateful for the fact that this urgent question has been brought. It could not be, indeed, more urgent. Last month, Mr. Speaker, I visited South Sudan to assess the situation in Sudan and to meet those who've been forced to flee horrendous violence. The scenes of suffering and devastation that I heard about from families that have been torn apart, children who were on the brink of starvation, have been etched in my memory. We now have confirmation that the senseless war between the Sudanese Armed Forces, or SAF, SAF, and the Rapid Support Forces has brought famine to Sudan. In northern Darfur's Zamzam IDP camp, which hosts over 500,000 people, 100 people are dying from starvation every day. But we have to be clear that these conditions exist across Sudan. We should be discussing a more damning assessment today, but a sustained tactic of denying access to the hardest hit areas of the country is making many people and their suffering invisible. The famine facing Sudan is almost entirely man-made and a direct consequence of the deliberate efforts by both warring parties to block aid getting to those most in need. The warring parties must remember their obligations under international humanitarian law. Access must not be arbitrarily denied, and starvation must not be used as a weapon of war. The UK welcomes the decision to reopen the Adre border crossing for humanitarian assistance for 3 months. This move, if conducted in good faith, could save thousands of lives. The SAF must act to remove any unnecessary restrictions on trucks moving through Adre, and the RSF must urgently facilitate movement into areas under their control. Without this, life-saving aid will be blocked from accessing those most in need. Now, last month, I announced an additional £15 million of vital assistance to Sudan, South Sudan and Chad to support vulnerable people forced to flee violence and seek safety. With this announcement, the UK has almost doubled its ODA to Sudan to £97 million this financial year, most of which is vital humanitarian aid. The UK has also welcomed efforts by the US, Saudi Arabia and Switzerland to bring the warring parties to the negotiating table last month. But we remain deeply concerned that the SAF did not take the opportunity to act in the best interests of the people they claim to represent, refusing to attend the talks in person. The warring parties must do everything in their power to ensure that this wholly unjustified war must end immediately. We also continue to call upon the RSF to implement the commitments made in the Jeddah Declaration to protect civilians. We stand ready to support partners in following up on these talks, including using the UK's role as penholder on Sudan at the UN Security Council. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, for granting this urgent question. Yesterday, Parliament spent time on 2 terrible conflicts in Ukraine and in the Middle East, but we must not allow this Parliament to forget about the increasingly dreadful situation in Sudan. And I welcome the Right Honourable Lady to her position. And I know that she has just come back from visiting South Sudan, and I welcome the focus that she is clearly putting on the situation. It is an absolutely urgent situation with 10 million people internally displaced. 4 million of them are children. 2 million have fled as refugees, and half the country's population of 47 million now needs food aid. 750,000 people are starving in a famine that has only been made worse by this recent flooding. So I want to urge the government to pay really urgent attention to this situation. We cannot lose the momentum and focus on resolving this conflict and on improving access for humanitarian aid. The UK is the penholder at the United Nations, and with Norway and the United States, we form the Troika, which can act as an interlocutor with the warring parties. What progress is being initiated to follow up on the unsuccessful effort recently, last month, to try and bring the Sudanese armed forces to the table. The US Special Envoy, Tom Perriello, has been working very hard on trying to make progress, but what role is the UK government playing? It's also very welcome that the Adre crossing has opened and that there is now some improvement in humanitarian access, but the UK, again, has a key role to play in bringing other donors together for Sudan. And what plans does the UK government have itself to convene other influential regional players like the African Union, like the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, where our extensive and excellent diplomatic network can make such an important difference? And overall, what strategy does the UK government have to counteract the growing influence of Russia in the region, where they are fomenting these conflicts, both in Sudan and in nearby countries like Libya, in order to gain access to Red Sea and Mediterranean ports and encourage migration patterns such as those that we have seen?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful to the Right Honourable Lady's commitment on these incredibly important questions. She talked about some of the figures around those who've been displaced. Well, indeed, Sudan currently is the world's largest displacement crisis in absolute terms. Of course, some of those individuals have been displaced before. I particularly talked when I was in South Sudan to those who had left South Sudan because it had been so unsafe, gone into Sudan and then been forced back into South Sudan once more. So this really is a horrendous crisis, and it's one that deserves international focus, and that is what we are determined to provide as a new UK government, of course recognising what took place previously under previous government as well. We want to ensure this crisis is given the attention that it deserves. That includes, of course, through being the penholder, as she rightly noted, at the UN, but also continuously urging those warring parties to come to the table and ensuring that the voices of civil society, of course, are not ignored here. That's been particularly important for the UK to make sure that we are actually convening those civil society actors. I met with some of them myself when I was in Ethiopia and Addis Ababa. Clearly they're not able to operate in Sudan, many of them. It's too dangerous, but they're seeking still to make sure that voice of civil society, including women, is listened to. She talked about applying international pressure to partners, and just very briefly to finish in my response to her, I would say that of course is important positively when it comes to the work we can do together. So again, when I was in Addis, I met with the African Union, with Commissioner Bankole, to talk with him about what we could do together, ensuring that other regional actors are brought in to push forward peace and the ceasefire that's so desperately needed, the humanitarian access that's needed. But of course, there's also that negative issue of the other countries that are becoming involved in this conflict, that are worsening it. And the UK government is absolutely clear. Engagement with the warring parties in any measure that is not focused on humanitarian access or peace, that engagement will only prolong this devastating war, which is leading to so much death and destruction.
Dan Carden.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is one of the world's worst conflicts and humanitarian disasters, and sadly receives so little of our attention. I welcome the urgent question and the Minister's statement. Can I praise the efforts of the British Embassy in exile in Addis? It's clear we need a long-term strategy to contribute to end the fighting and begin a political settlement. And I just wonder what plans the Minister has to send UK personnel back into Sudan when the time is right, perhaps based on the port of Sudan, until a return to Khartoum is possible.
Minister.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for raising this, and I have to say that the staff from the UK Embassy that was previously in Sudan really did show the best of UK government. No question about that. They were placed in a truly horrendous, terrifying situation at the time of the beginning of this conflict, effectively under siege in the middle of the beginning of a dreadful war. They've shown the best of government, no question about that, and I praise them. I was very pleased to be able to meet with a number of them when I was in Addis Ababa. They're operating obviously out of Ethiopia Ethiopia currently because it's too dangerous for them to be operating within Sudan. I know they would be, of course, very keen to ensure that we do have that presence, but of course we also need to ensure safety, and my goodness, that was really tested previously, and again I praise their bravery in that case.
Liberal Democrat spokesman Layla Moran.
May I congratulate the Shadow Minister for securing this urgent question and you, Mr Speaker, for granting it, because as we've heard, this could not be more urgent. Over 25 million people are suffering from acute food insecurity. That's more than half of the population. In one South Darfur health facility, 5 malnourished children were dying every day in July this year, and yet the plight as a whole has been largely met by silence from the international community. At the Paris donor meeting in April, the previous government did not commit to any additional humanitarian assistance, but just re-announced a previous commitment. So can the Minister tell the House what extra support the new government will provide from now on? And given that the conference itself only raised half of what is needed, the case for even more additional UK aid is clear. But we also need to play our part in securing a path to peace in Sudan as a whole. And given the UK's role as the penholder at the UN, can the Minister tell me what specific actions are being taken to prevent the supply of arms by neighbouring countries? Given the distressing news that a slave market has opened outside Khartoum, what actions are they taking to prevent humanitarian trafficking through the conflict as well?
I'm very grateful to the member for Oxford West and Abingdon for raising these important points. And I would say, first of all, when it comes to UK support in this area, we have doubled the overseas development assistance contribution coming from the UK, recognising the severity of this crisis. That means that I announced another £15 million of vital assistance on the 22nd of August, bringing that up to £97 million. Obviously focused on Sudan, where it's possible to operate. Of course, much of the country is very, very difficult to access, including for humanitarian bodies now, but also for those fleeing to South Sudan and Chad as well. She talked about neighbouring countries. I would mention the fact that there are a number of countries which we would be very, very clear in urging to not engage in destabilising activity. I know I mentioned this a moment ago in response to the Shadow Development Minister, but any activity that is not focused on humanitarian support or on promoting peace is effectively prolonging the war, it's worsening the humanitarian situation, and it's creating a legacy for the future, which will be very, very difficult to deal with. We're seeing large numbers of unaccompanied children, for example, a really, really disturbing situation. So we want that message to be heard loud and clear.
Sarah Champ.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I appreciate it. I wish that this conflict and resulting famine wasn't stopped before it started, and I'm grateful for the Secretary of State's commitment to it. However, when the International Development Select Committee took evidence in April, we very much found that it was a war on women. So can the Secretary of State please tell us what specifically she is doing to protect women from the horrendous rapes that are going on, from the sexual abuse, and what she is doing for the Foreign Secretary team to gather atrocity prevention data?
Minister.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for mentioning this, and of course she has great expertise in this area, and we're deeply concerned about the escalation of conflict-related sexual violence that we've seen taking place in Sudan since the outbreak of the conflict in April 2023. We've seen reports that I know she will be well aware of, and others in the House, that, for example, there have been 262 rape cases reported over the period from April to August. That is likely to be a massive underestimate of the situation on the ground. Disturbingly, we're seeing those women and girls who are subject to sexual violence in IDP camps when they're travelling, at checkpoints, even in their own homes, when they're trying to get firewood, when they're desperately trying to get support for their families. There are also reports of kidnapping, ransom and sexual exploitation. She asked, what is the UK doing on this? We continue to condemn those atrocities against women and girls. We've called out human rights violations, especially conflict-related sexual violence carried out by the parties to the conflict, and we've done that within the UN Human Rights Council and Security Council, and we're working to ensure that evidence is indeed collected.
Sir Gavin Williamson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The The fighting in Sudan is not just having an impact on that country itself, but also neighbouring countries such as South Sudan, who can't actually export its natural resources. What action is the government taking to try and see if they can open up channels for countries such as South Sudan to be able to export the goods in order to feed their people in their country as well?
Minister.
Yeah, I'm grateful to the right honourable gentleman for raising this, and of course he will be aware that there was already a humanitarian crisis in South Sudan. I visited the Bentiu refugee camp, which houses 100,000 people and effectively an island of marooned people within a kind of lake of floodwater at the moment. There was already a crisis there. He's absolutely right. The economic prospects have gone even further backwards with the crisis. The main oil pipeline, of course, has been impacted by the conflict within Sudan. So we've been having discussions with international partners about what can be done to try and improve that situation. I had discussions, for example, with the World Bank when I was in Juba in South Sudan about what can be done around economic reform, and I would say there is a role for the government of South Sudan in ensuring that economic reform actually takes place. I made that very clear, that that reform needs to take place, that we need to see strong action. We also need to see elections, and of course that impact of the Sudan conflict is being felt, as you said, in South Sudan too.
To speak on behalf of the Newport Sudanese community who came together yesterday in Peel to open their new community centre, and who I know feel that this conflict and this famine of such epic proportions still goes largely unseen. Can I ask the Minister to reiterate again to those who hear such horrific stories from family and friends that we will all do all that we can as the pen holder on Sudan at the UN Security Council to ensure that international attention and actions are not too little and too late, and that crucially aid gets to the right places?
Minister.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for raising the important point about diaspora communities within the UK. I also have spoken with many people with Sudanese heritage within the UK who are deeply concerned about the situation at home. There are very, very few people, in fact, I'm yet to meet someone who has Sudanese heritage who's not been impacted somehow with a close family member who hasn't been killed, subject to violence, had to flee, or indeed is in food insecurity. So I pay tribute to the Sudanese community in Newport across our country, and most certainly their plight is not being forgotten.
Sir Julian.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I commend the Minister for having made her visit so promptly. It seems to me that this conflict, judging by the amount of coverage that the conflict in Ukraine and Middle East gets, night after night on the news, ought similarly to be constantly featuring in our media. Why is that not happening? Is it purely because of the denial of journalistic access?
Minister.
Yeah, I'm very grateful to the right honourable gentleman for raising this, and it's a question that I've thought about a lot myself, how we can ensure that we have that elevation of this crisis, because one does fear that in the future people will look back and say, why was more not done about this, given the huge humanitarian toll, the biggest displacement crisis obviously in the world, the famine that the UK government recognises. I do know there are some very committed journalists who are covering this, and I praise their actions. I hope that there can be additional coverage and that there can be greater awareness internationally as well. And this really is important for the globe. It's important for the UN, for other multilateral organisations as well, and this government will do all that we can to raise the profile within those bodies.
Peter Powell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There has now been over 500 days of war in Sudan, and we know the geopolitical context is very complex, to say the least. There have been reports of summary executions and torture from Human Rights Watch. So can the government commit to galvanising the international crisis response that is needed to hold international partners to account so the Sudanese people receive the commitment and attention that they deserve?
Minister.
Yeah, I'm grateful to my honourable friend for raising this incredibly important point, and we have indeed, as she eloquently spelled out, seen a really disturbing increase in human rights abuses taking place within Sudan. There's been escalation of violence, obviously, but we've seen many civilians being killed, sexual assaults of women, as we talked about before, and the restriction of humanitarian access and journalistic access as well. The UK will ensure that there is continued scrutiny of Sudan at the UN Human Rights Council. We're the leader of the core group alongside Germany, Norway and the United States. We've been seeking to use that position as actively as possible to raise this, but also so that colleagues are aware, the UK is funding the Centre for Information Resilience, which is a research body that's gathering open source evidence about the ongoing fighting. That's incredibly important for long-term accountability around those who are abusing human rights so appallingly in Sudan.
Stephen Gethin.
Mr. Speaker, and thanks for the time that's been given to this today, and thank the Minister. This is the gravest humanitarian situation on earth, and I'm grateful for her remarks about evidence gathering around universal crimes. However, I'm a little bit concerned I've yet to hear something in terms of what we're doing in terms of concrete action to enforce an arms embargo and stop arms from reaching the conflict zones.
Minister.
I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for being very clear about the magnitude of this appalling conflict and the need to do all that we can to prevent it. The UK government has sought to use every lever we can to put pressure in this area, whether that's political, diplomatic, humanitarian, and also to use every venue that we can to be very, very clear. And I reiterate that the warring parties and those who are supporting them, becoming engaged in this conflict, must cease their actions that are having such a negative impact on the population. Those who are getting engaged, to the extent this is becoming a proxy situation, every single day that they do that, they are contributing to that humanitarian crisis. The UK could not be clearer in our language on this.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, despite Sudan experiencing one of the most severe humanitarian crises in the world, the previous government failed to expand safe routes for those in Sudan, even for those who have family here. In light of the ever-worsening situation on the ground, what steps will our new government take to help those fleeing the conflict reunite with loved ones and find safety in the UK?
So I'm grateful to my honourable friend for mentioning the situation of those who've been forced to flee Sudan. The pattern for those fleeing conflict is quite a differentiated one. So those who were already often in humanitarian need or with low resources, many of them have been forced into Chad, in particular, obviously from Darfur. You're then also seeing the development that I mentioned earlier around those being forced back into South Sudan. There are also many people who've moved into Egypt, and we've seen a really significant expansion of the Sudanese population there. I think all of us as parliamentarians would remember what happened at the beginning of the conflict when there was that evacuation. I pay tribute to civil servants who were involved in ensuring that that took place, but it was a very, very difficult time. Of course, we're very much taking seriously our commitments around ensuring that refugees are protected in the region. Thank you.
Sybil Roberts.
And I'm too very grateful that there's been our time given for this urgent question. Of course, groups like the Zahawa are facing genocide in Sudan, and as a result, many young Zahawa men have fled to Europe, and some live in makeshift camps along the French coast. They wish to come to the UK for a particular reason, because the Sudan is a former colony of the British Empire, and they were taught English at school. The like of Tommy Robinson demonise them for being young and male. It is precisely because they are young men that they are most at risk of being slaughtered by the Janjaweed. Will the government look again? Because there is a particular historical duty of care towards people from the Sudan and allow safe passage to the Zahawa, who, of course, are fleeing a genocide.
Well, in response to the honourable lady, we'll be very clear that there must not be demonisation of individuals from any heritage or background. And we are seeing a situation where there is a separation that's been undertaken by some of the warring parties so that it's becoming impossible for fathers to leave with their children, for uncles, grandfathers to leave, that they're being separated, unfortunately, and being effectively press-ganged into supporting some of the warring parties. It's extremely disturbing. Of course, we've seen that previously, but we're seeing it again intensifying. And I met, in fact, a young boy whose uncle had been subject to that and who escaped pretty much by the skin of his teeth. We will ensure that we are focusing on those human rights, including for young men, for everybody in those situations. But really the critical thing is going to be ensuring that Sudan itself has the ceasefire that is desperately needed, that there is the de-escalation, that there is greater regional stability. That's what's going to be important in both the medium and long term.
Laura Kirk-Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for dedicating time to this crisis. Given the challenges of getting international aid into Sudan, the humanitarian response is very dependent on local, community-led emergency response rooms. What measures is this government taking to ensure that funding reaches these frontline responders? Thank you.
Minister.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for raising this, and of course she has considerable expertise on these issues before she became a Member of Parliament, and we are concerned about the situation when it comes to access for humanitarian aid into Sudan. I talked a little about this earlier, but it really is important that we do not see unreasonable impediments being put into place. I do recognise what she mentions, which is about community support being provided, and I met with some representatives from the so-called emergency response rooms. Also met, as I said before, with some of the civil society voices from Sudan who are also engaged in that humanitarian effort. It is important that their contribution is recognised. They are not part of the warring parties. They are completely politically neutral. For that reason, of course, they are being targeted themselves.
James McCleary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Minister, can I ask what efforts are being made to gather testimony and evidence of war crimes, breaches of international humanitarian law and indeed ethnic cleansing that we all know is taking place in Sudan at the moment?
Minister.
So I'm grateful to the honourable member for raising this. I mentioned before the fact that the UK is supporting the Centre for Information Resilience, which is a research body, gathering that evidence about what's taking place on the ground. And, for example, funding has been provided for the Sudan Witness Project, which is investigating attacks against civilians and infrastructure. When it comes to specifically the finding of genocide, I would be clear that obviously that's an internationally focused definition, but we are concerned that we're seeing patterns of violence which bear the hallmarks of that kind of a development. So we're obviously keeping this very closely under review.
Gordon McKee.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I thank the Minister for her statement. Sudan has borders with 7 countries, home to around 280 million people, and all of those countries now face the destabilising flow of guns and mercenaries. So, can I ask the Minister what assessment the UK Government has made of the impact of this civil war on the humanitarian crisis, not just in Sudan, but in neighbouring countries as well?
Minister.
My honourable friend raised a very important point there because, as I mentioned previously, we already saw, for example, in South Sudan, but also in other neighbouring countries, extreme humanitarian needs. Clearly, the conflict in Sudan is making that situation even worse in many of those nations. I am grateful to those nations who have opened their borders so that those fleeing conflict are able to actually move out of that conflict situation. But clearly, that's coming at significant cost in situations where there's already considerable humanitarian needs. South Sudan, for example, already has the worst maternal mortality in the entire world. It has statistics which place it right at the bottom of the Human Development Index of all countries. This is only making that situation worse, I regret to say.
James Shannon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Minister very much for her reassuring words in relation to how to help those in Sudan. Bearing in mind that some 10 million displaced in Sudan, with 25 million people suffering food insecurity, it is very clear there's a humanitarian crisis unfolding of gigantic proportions. In particular, Mr. Speaker, if I can declare an interest as Chair of the APPG of Freedom of Religious Belief, 9,000 Christians killed, 6 million Christians displaced, 165 churches destroyed and closed, human rights violations of rape, kidnapping and looting. Sudan is the 8th worst place in the world to be a Christian. It's also clear that there is much more that must be done. Can I ask the Minister very respectfully, what steps is the Minister taking to work with NGOs on the ground to get support to the people who need it the most? The vulnerable, the ill, the women and the children.
Hear, hear. Minister.
Yeah, I'm very grateful to the Honourable Member for raising this, and he's absolutely right, sadly, about the scale of this humanitarian disaster that we see unfolding. He's also sadly right about the human rights abuses, and he mentioned religious minorities, also the impact on, of course, women and girls that we talked about before. We're seeing extremely disturbing situations within Sudan. We will continue to do all that we can to raise the profile of this issue. The humanitarian situation in Sudan was a priority for me as the new Minister for Development. As soon as I came in to office, I was determined that I should be briefed on this situation. It's an enormous crisis, and we in the UK must do all we can to ensure politically, diplomatically, economically and in humanitarian terms we're playing our part.
Adam Jokey.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday I heard from 2 Sudanese constituents born in Sudan who are now doctors in Newcastle-under-Lyme, and they are rightly and understandably very worried indeed. Now, we've heard from the Minister the engagement with the World Bank, with the African Union and the United Nations, but many of our European neighbours have colonial ties to this part of Africa, as do we. So what specific and direct conversations has she had with European colleagues to urge them to do their bit to help resolve this crisis?
Minister.
So I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for mentioning this, and the Sudanese doctors groups have been actually very important within the UK at raising the profile of these issues, trying to make sure that information, as was mentioned before, about the situation on the ground is actually coming through and being reported in the media. We will continue to work multilaterally but also bilaterally as well, and I have discussed these matters, for example, with counterparts from Norway, from Germany, from a number of other European nations, also with the current EU Commissioner for Development, who is going to be moving on, obviously, with a new commission, but clearly we need to be working together to try and resolve these matters. Thank you.
Alice MacDonald.
Thank you very much for this important debate, and thank you, Mr. Speaker. Children are often on the front lines of conflict, and that is no different in Sudan, where a whole generation of children are living a nightmare and facing a catastrophe. Can the Minister expand on the specific measures being taken to protect children, both in terms of immediate humanitarian aid, but also to raise the important issue of children's rights?
Minister.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for raising this, and of course again she comes with considerable expertise on these matters before she became a member of Parliament, and I think the kinds of appalling situations that children are finding themselves in because of this conflict really must be raised up the international agenda. I met with some children who had escaped Sudan when I was in South Sudan. Those children could not smile anymore. There was nothing that they could see for their future in that situation. It was extremely disturbing. They'd lost their parents. They'd seen, for example, siblings dying of measles, siblings dying of diarrhoea while they were trying to escape the conflict in Sudan. A truly horrendous situation, and children's rights must indeed be raised. There's also, of course, the situation of children when it comes to the activity of the warring parties, and again, the UK government would be calling on them to make sure that they're following international humanitarian law, and above all, that we have that ceasefire that's so desperately needed.
That completes the urgent question. We'll let the front benches change over. Take care.
Thank you.
No problem. Take care.